March 16th, 1485. Inside the Palace of Westminster, a young queen collapsed, gasping for air as her lungs rotted from within. The corridors echoed not with prayers, but with whispers. Whispers that her husband, King Richard III, had poisoned her. Eager to cast aside a dying wife and seize her niece as a new bride. Truth or rumor, it no longer mattered. What mattered was this: the crown on Anne Neville's head was hollow. It had never brought her power, only loss, suspicion, and an early death at 28. A Queen of England, reduced to a shadow. A life that ended not in triumph, but in silence. She was born into fire, not the fire of hearths or candles, but the fire of ambition, war, and blood. Anne Neville entered the world on June 11th, 1456, within the thick walls of Warwick Castle. To most, it was a fortress. To her, it was a cradle surrounded by weapons. Her father was Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, better known as the Kingmaker. A man who could topple crowns as if they were dice thrown across a table. Anne's earliest memories were gilded with banners, crests, and armor polished until it shone like mirrors. Servants bowed as she passed, courtiers whispered her name, and minstrels sang of her father's unmatched power. But even as a child, she knew the music was not for her. It was for him. She was not the melody, only the echo. The Kingmaker's house was not built of stone alone. It was constructed of shifting alliances, betrayals, and calculated risks. He decided who would sit upon the throne of England, and in the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses, his word was sharper than any blade. One day, he raised Edward of York as king. Another day, he turned against him, like a storm that betrays its sailors. Anne and her sister Isabel grew up in this storm. Their childhood was not one of dolls and games, but of tutors and lessons in obedience. They learned to stitch fine embroidery while armies marched outside. They read Latin prayers while their father plotted the next betrayal. Each lesson came with an unspoken truth. Daughters were not born for themselves. They were born as pawns to be placed upon the board of power. For Anne, that board was already soaked in blood. She was a child when she first smelled the iron stench of war drifting through the corridors of Warwick. She heard the clang of armor in the courtyard, the frantic gallop of horses, the shouts of men whose loyalty could shift in a single night. And she watched her father smile, as if he alone could command the storm. To the world, Anne Neville was a jewel, valuable only because of the man who owned her. She had her mother's beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed too gentle for the age in which she lived. Courtiers whispered that she was delicate, but delicacy in that world was a curse. A soft flower pressed between the pages of a book called War. Her father had no sons, no male heir to inherit Warwick's lands, wealth, and legacy. That meant Anne and Isabel carried the weight of dynasties on their shoulders. Their marriages would not be their own. They would be bargains struck in candlelit chambers, signatures written in blood. They would not marry for love. They would be given away for power. Anne saw it coming. Even as a girl, she felt it in every glance her father cast toward her, measuring, calculating, deciding where she could be moved next. To him, she was never just a daughter. She was a piece of the crown itself, forged in flesh rather than gold. And yet, despite the shadows, there were moments of tenderness. Warwick Castle, high above the river Avon, gave her fragments of peace. She would wander its halls, listening to her mother's soft voice, watching the flicker of fire on tapestries, tracing her fingers along the cold stone walls. In the gardens, she smelled roses blooming red. Roses that would one day bleed into the emblem of Lancaster and York alike. The Wars of the Roses lived even in flowers. Anne's mother, Anne de Beauchamp, was a quieter figure, overshadowed by her husband's storm. But she gave her daughters lessons their father never could: patience, silence, survival. She taught Anne to hide her true feelings behind a calm face, to bow when her heart wanted to scream, to endure when there was no escape. Skills not of queens, but of survivors. Still, childhood was brief. The world did not allow innocence to last. By the time Anne turned 10, she was already a prize in negotiations. Her name was spoken not as a girl's, but as currency. Marriage contracts were discussed, alliances weighed, dowries calculated like the price of soldiers. She began to realize that her father's title, the Kingmaker, was also her curse. For every king he crowned, for every alliance he forged, his daughters were dragged deeper into the labyrinth. They were not just Neville daughters. They were potential queens, duchesses, or pawns to be discarded. Anne's destiny was written long before she could read it, and she knew it. She would sit in her chamber, the embroidered cloth resting on her lap, and listen to the men outside argue about crowns. Sometimes she wondered what freedom tasted like, what it would mean to choose her own path, her own love, her own life. But those thoughts were dangerous. In Warwick Castle, freedom was a word never spoken aloud. The Wars of the Roses were not just battles fought on muddy fields. They were wars fought in the bodies of women like Anne. Wars that turned their marriages into treaties, their wombs into weapons, their children into heirs or corpses. And Anne, even as a child, sensed that her life would be given to the war long before she could live it. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anne had seen enough to know the truth. Crowns glitter, but they cut deeper than swords. The throne was not a seat, it was a blade. And every woman forced near it bled. Her father believed himself immortal, untouchable, a master of kings. But Anne, quiet and watchful, saw something else. She saw that every crown her father placed came with a curse, that one day the storm he conjured would swallow them all. And when that storm came, she would not be spared. She was only 14 when her name was written into the ledger of war. The year was 1470, and England was a graveyard of shifting loyalties. York and Lancaster. White rose against red. Families divided. Brothers set against brothers. The crown itself passed like a hunted animal from hand to hand. And Anne Neville, daughter of the Kingmaker, was summoned not as a child, but as an answer to a question of power. Her father had betrayed King Edward IV, the monarch he himself had raised to the throne. Now Warwick sought to restore Henry VI, the broken and half-mad king of Lancaster, and to seal the pact, he needed his daughter. Anne's hand would bind the blood of Neville to the blood of Lancaster. The match was Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales. He was only a year older than Anne, a boy groomed for vengeance. His mother, Margaret of Anjou, was the fiercest queen of her age, a woman who had fought battles as boldly as any man. To Margaret, Anne was not a bride. She was a weapon. The marriage was hurried, political, and entirely cold. No one asked Anne what she wanted. She stood in a chapel in France, her voice trembling as she repeated vows she had never dreamed of. The candles flickered. The Latin words echoed off the stone, and in that moment, her childhood ended. Edward of Westminster was no gentle husband. Accounts describe him as cruel, violent, consumed by rage at the Yorkist usurpers. whether those stories were sharpened by enemies or born of truth. Anne felt the sharp edge of his presence. He was not her partner, he was her prison, a boy already molded by blood into a weapon. For Anne, the wedding ring was not gold, it was iron. She followed her new husband and his mother into exile, into plans of invasion, into nights when whispered strategy replaced the lullabies she should still have known. She was 15, wrapped in silks that could not hide her fear, forced to play the part of a princess of Lancaster. But destiny is crueler than politics. In May 1471, the armies clashed at Tewkesbury. Anne's husband led the charge, young and reckless, eager to spill Yorkist blood. He never returned. Edward of Westminster, the only son of Henry VI, fell in battle. Some say he was slain in the field. Others whisper he was captured and butchered in cold blood after the fight. However it happened, he died at 16. Anne became a widow before she had ever truly been a wife. Imagine it. 15 years old, standing in the wreckage of Tewkesbury, her husband's body lost among the dead, her mother-in-law a fugitive, her father already a corpse at Barnet. In the space of weeks, everything that had defined her was erased. She was no longer the daughter of the Kingmaker. He was buried. No longer the wife of Lancaster's heir. He was slain. No longer the hope of an alliance. Her value had dissolved in the mud of Tewkesbury Field. What remained was a girl, a widow, a pawn discarded from the board. In those days, widowhood was not freedom. It was a chain of its own. Anne's life was not her own to rebuild. She was property, drifting between powerful hands, each one deciding what to do with her fragile body. Some accounts suggest she was hidden away, even disguised as a servant in a London household, to keep her safe or perhaps to conceal her until a new bargain could be struck. What thoughts haunted her then? Did she grieve Edward of Westminster, the husband she hardly knew? Did she fear the Yorkist victors, whose king her father had betrayed? Or did she simply feel the weight of emptiness, that hollow truth that her life, once again, was not hers? She had worn a crown as a bride, briefly, a promise of becoming Queen of England through Lancaster's line. But that crown had shattered in a single battle. It turned to ashes before it could ever gleam. Anne was 15, and she already carried the marks of war, deeper than scars. The Wars of the Roses devoured men by the thousands, but it devoured women differently. For women like Anne, the battlefield was their marriage bed, their wombs, their very existence turned into contracts of power. She had survived Tewkesbury, but survival was no victory. It was exile, humiliation, and silence. In the chronicles of that year, Anne appears like a shadow, mentioned, moved, forgotten, and then rediscovered. A girl lost in the aftermath of betrayal and defeat. She was no longer Warwick's prize, no longer Lancaster's hope. She was only Anne, unmoored, unclaimed, unwanted, yet history rarely leaves pawns lying on the floor. Another hand would soon reach for her, another player would move her across the board. Her second marriage would be her most famous, binding her not to a prince in exile, but to a Duke of York, who would one day seize the crown. But at that moment, in 1471, Anne was nothing more than a relic of a broken alliance. A girl in black, barely 15, watching her future dissolve into smoke. And if anyone had asked her then what she wanted, if anyone had dared, perhaps she would have whispered the same truth she carried her whole life. That the crown was hollow. That the game was rigged. That her name, her body, her life had never belonged to her. at all. She had been given to war at 14. By 15, war had already taken everything back. Anne Neville did not lose her father in a quiet deathbed farewell. She lost him in the roar of battle, in the chaos of banners torn down, in the clash of steel on steel. It was April 1471, the Battle of Barnet. The Kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, rode into the storm he had himself created. For years he had played king against king, crown against crown. Now he paid the price. In the thick fog of that battlefield, he was cut down, his lifeblood spilling into the mud. Anne was 14, too young to understand the full weight of politics, but old enough to feel the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her father had been the sun of her universe. Overbearing, merciless, brilliant, terrifying. He had defined every breath she took, every decision made for her. He was the reason she mattered at all. To be his daughter was to be powerful by proxy. Without him, she was a shadow cast without a flame. When news of his death reached her, she was already in France, hastily married to Edward of Westminster. But even across the sea, the blow struck deep. The man who had pulled kings from their thrones, the man whose name was enough to shake the kingdom, now lay still in the dirt. His corpse was stripped and displayed, his pride ground into humiliation. The Kingmaker could no longer make kings. He could not even save himself. For Anne, this was more than grief. It was annihilation. In the same year, she lost both husband and father. 2 anchors torn away in the storm. Her husband slain at Tewkesbury, her father butchered at Barnet. She was adrift in a kingdom where the tides of war had no mercy. Consider it. In the span of weeks, Anne transformed from Princess of Lancaster to widowed orphan. Once a pawn carefully placed on the board, now a discarded piece, swept away with the bloodied debris of war. Her mother, Anne de Beauchamp, fared no better. With her husband dead and her estate seized, she was pushed into obscurity, stripped of power, forced into the margins of court life. The proud House of Warwick, once feared, was reduced to whispers and ashes. Anne herself became vulnerable. A prize, yes, but one without protection. Every nobleman, every court faction, looked at her not as a grieving child, but as an opportunity. She carried the Neville inheritance, vast estates and titles that could make any man rich beyond measure. But she also carried the curse of her father's downfall. In London, her fate became a subject of speculation. Some claimed she was hidden in a commoner's household, disguised in servant's clothes to keep her safe from those who might exploit her. Others said she was carefully guarded, her hand already bartered to the highest bidder. In truth, she was trapped in silence, waiting for someone else to decide her future. And here lies the cruel paradox. The more noble a woman was, the less free she became. The higher her bloodline, the less control she had over her body, her destiny, her very breath. Anne understood this. Each loss carved it deeper into her bones. She had been groomed as a piece in her father's game, and now that he was gone, she was nothing more than leftover strategy, a card no longer in play. The grief was real, but it had no space to exist. She could not wear mourning openly. She could not choose retreat. Every move she made would be decided for her by others, by victors who had little interest in her sorrow. The chronicles record Anne as passive, silent. But silence is not absence. It is survival. It is the only weapon left when all else has been taken. Imagine her, 15 years old, staring out from the narrow window of a chamber, the sounds of London drifting up from the streets. She would see markets bustling, hear the laughter of children, feel the pulse of life below. Yet she herself was caught in stillness, unable to descend into the ordinary. Her name bound her to the extraordinary, and in that extraordinary world, there was no mercy. Her father had been called the Kingmaker, but his death left Anne with nothing. No crown, no husband, no inheritance, no protection. What she had was absence. Absence of family, absence of love, absence of choice. And in that absence, something hardened. A quiet endurance, the kind taught by her mother in whispers. If her father had forged power through ambition, Anne would survive through silence. She learned to fade, to endure, to pass through halls like a shadow no one noticed. But shadows are not safe. They are seen by those who hunt in darkness. Soon, another hand would seize her, another player would claim her body, her titles, her silence. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, younger brother of Edward IV, would see in her both vulnerability and opportunity. He would become her second husband, and through him, she would wear the crown of England. Yet at that moment, in the wake of Barnet and Tewkesbury, Anne had nothing but loss. The daughter of the most powerful man in England had become an orphan. The bride of a prince had become a widow. She was only 15, and already she carried more graves than dreams. Her father's death marked more than the fall of a man. It marked the fall of her world. The foundation beneath her feet had cracked. And though history would paint her as a quiet queen, in that silence lived the echo of a child who had lost everything before she had even begun to live. No father, no husband, no anchor, only the void. Anne Neville did not lose her father in a quiet deathbed farewell. She lost him in the roar of battle, in the chaos of banners torn down, in the clash of steel on steel. It was April 1471, the Battle of Barnet. The Kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, rode into the storm he had himself created. For years he had played king against king, crown against crown. Now he paid the price. In the thick fog of that battlefield, he was cut down, his lifeblood spilling into the mud. Anne was 14, too young to understand the full weight of politics, but old enough to feel the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her father had been the sun of her universe. Overbearing, merciless, brilliant, terrifying. He had defined every breath she took, every decision made for her. He was the reason she mattered at all. To be his daughter was to be powerful by proxy. Without him, she was a shadow cast without a flame. When news of his death reached her, she was already in France, hastily married to Edward of Westminster. But even across the sea, the blow struck deep. The man who had pulled kings from their thrones, the man whose name was enough to shake the kingdom, now lay still in the dirt. His corpse was stripped and displayed, his pride ground into humiliation. The Kingmaker could no longer make kings. He could not even save himself. For Anne, this was more than grief. It was annihilation. In the same year, she lost both husband and father. 2 anchors torn away in the storm. Her husband slain at Tewkesbury, her father butchered at Barnet. She was adrift in a kingdom where the tides of war had no mercy. Consider it. In the span of weeks, Anne transformed from Princess of Lancaster to widowed orphan. Once a pawn carefully placed on the board, now a discarded piece, swept away with the bloodied debris of war. Her mother, Anne de Beauchamp, fared no better. With her husband dead and her estate seized, she was pushed into obscurity, stripped of power, forced into the margins of court life. The proud House of Warwick once feared, was reduced to whispers and ashes. Anne herself became vulnerable. A prize, yes, but one without protection. Every nobleman, every court faction looked at her not as a grieving child, but as an opportunity. She carried the Neville inheritance, vast estates and titles that could make any man rich beyond measure. But she also carried the curse of her father's downfall. In London, her fate became a subject of speculation. Some claimed she was hidden in a commoner's household, disguised in servant's clothes to keep her safe from those who might exploit her. Others said she was carefully guarded, her hand already bartered to the highest bidder. In truth, she was trapped in silence, waiting for someone else to decide her future. And here lies the cruel paradox. The more noble a woman was, the less free she became. The higher her bloodline, the less control she had over her body, her destiny, her very breath. Anne understood this. Each loss carved it deeper into her bones. She had been groomed as a piece in her father's game, and now that he was gone, she was nothing more than leftover strategy, a card no longer in play. The grief was real, but it had no space to exist. She could not wear mourning openly. She could not choose retreat. Every move she made would be decided for her by others, by victors who had little interest in her sorrow. The chronicles record Anne as passive, silent. But silence is not absence. It is survival. It is the only weapon left when all else has been taken. Imagine her, 15 years old, staring out from the narrow window of a chamber, the sounds of London drifting up from the streets. She would see markets bustling, hear the laughter of children, feel the pulse of life below. Yet she herself was caught in stillness, unable to descend into the ordinary. Her name bound her to the extraordinary, and in that extraordinary world, there was no mercy. Her father had been called the Kingmaker, but his death left Anne with nothing. No crown, no husband, no inheritance, no protection. What she had was absence. Absence of family, absence of love, absence of choice. And in that absence, something hardened. A quiet endurance, the kind taught by her mother in whispers. If her father had forged power through ambition, Anne would survive through silence. She learned to fade, to endure, to pass through halls like a shadow no one noticed. But shadows are not safe. They are seen by those who hunt in darkness. Soon, another hand would seize her, another player would claim her body, her titles, her silence. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, younger brother of Edward IV, would see in her both vulnerability and opportunity. He would become her second husband, and through him, she would wear the crown of England. Yet at that moment, in the wake of Barnet and Tewkesbury, Anne had nothing but loss. The daughter of the most powerful man in England had become an orphan. The bride of a prince had become a widow. She was only 15, and already she carried more graves than dreams. Her father's death marked more than the fall of a man. It marked the fall of her world. The foundation beneath her feet had cracked. And though history would paint her as a quiet queen, in that silence lived the echo of a child who had lost everything before she had even begun to live. No father, no husband, no anchor, only the void. For years, Anne Neville had worn silence like a cloak. But then, at last, came the moment she had been trained to await: motherhood. It was 1473, or perhaps 1476, the records are unclear, when Anne gave birth to her only child, a son, Edward of Middleham. For a brief moment, hope returned. The boy was small, fragile, but he breathed. He lived. And in his tiny cry, Anne heard the faint echo of her own redemption. She had fulfilled the one duty every queen was judged by. She had given her husband an heir. For Richard, Edward was the embodiment of security. With a son, his line was confirmed. The Neville inheritance would flow through him. The Yorkist crown, shaky and contested, had a new anchor. For Anne, Edward was something else. He was light, a child of her own blood. Not a pawn moved by her father, not a prince raised in exile, not a husband taken by war. He was hers, flesh of her flesh, the one thing that could not be bargained away. In the cold halls of Middleham Castle, where she and Richard often resided, Anne poured her fragile heart into the boy. Chroniclers do not record her words, but one can imagine them. Lullabies whispered against stone walls, prayers spoken into the silence, a hand lingering on the cradle longer than necessary. Perhaps for the first time, she felt what it meant to live not for crowns or titles, but for love. But history is merciless to fragile hopes. Edward of Middleham did not grow strong. He was sickly, pale, a boy of shadows. Some said it was the damp air of Middleham. Others blamed the bloodlines of York and Neville, tangled and weakened by centuries of intermarriage. Whatever the reason, the boy's body never matched the promise of his name. In April 1484, when Anne was 27, Edward died. He was only 10 years old. The chronicles are brief, as they often are when recording the deaths of children. A note in the rolls, a line in a letter. But the impact was shattering. Richard wept, the chroniclers say. He wept openly, a rare sight for a king. His heir, his only child, was gone. His dynasty fractured in a single heartbeat. For Anne, it was more than dynasty. It was the breaking of the last thread that tethered her to hope. Imagine her then, a woman who had lost her father, her first husband, her sister. Now she lost her son, the only person she had truly chosen to love, the only person who had given her life meaning. Her grief was private, invisible, swallowed by the walls of the palace, but it consumed her. From that year onward, her health faltered. She wasted away, her body thin, her spirit drained. The court watched her decline in silence, noting her absence from ceremonies, her pale face when she appeared. Whispers began, whispers that she was dying, whispers that she was no longer useful, whispers that her husband, the king, might put her aside. But before those whispers, there was only a mother's grief. Edward's death was more than personal tragedy. It was political collapse. Without an heir, Richard's reign became vulnerable. The crown trembled. Enemies sharpened their knives. The Yorkist cause, already fragile, now cracked under the weight of a child's coffin. For Anne, none of that mattered. The crown had always been hollow to her. She did not grieve for the Yorkist throne. She grieved for the boy whose laughter had once filled her chambers, whose hand had once reached for hers, whose life had been too short to escape the cruelty of their world. There are no poems, no portraits, no relics left of Edward of Middleham, only silence. Silence, and the knowledge that his death shattered his mother. Some said Anne withdrew completely after his passing, that she moved through the palace like a ghost, her steps faint, her eyes hollow, that she lived but no longer breathed. What is certain is this: Edward's death was the final wound. Her body never recovered, her heart never mended. Anne Neville had endured battlefields, betrayals, marriages made for power, crowns heavy with emptiness. She had endured silence, invisibility, suspicion. But this loss, the loss of her son, was too much. It broke what little was left of her. And so the story turns. For Richard, Edward's death was a political disaster. For Anne, it was a personal annihilation. And in the months that followed, the Queen began her slow descent toward her own grave. She was 27, a Queen of England, a mother without a child. And in the cold corridors of Westminster, where the air seemed always damp with history, her life began to fade. It would not be long before whispers of poison, scandal, and replacement surrounded her. But before all that, there was only this. A woman, once a mother, now a hollow shell. Her crown meant nothing. Her throne meant nothing. Without Edward, Anne Neville was already gone. After the death of her son, Anne Neville ceased to exist in the way a queen is meant to exist. She did not vanish from the palace. Her figure still drifted through Westminster's halls, still appeared at Richard's side when ceremony required it. But she was no longer seen. She had become a shadow, an outline of a woman who had once carried hope, now emptied of all substance. The court could sense it. They whispered when she passed, their voices rising like smoke. Her pale face, her frail body, her silence. It all fed the rumors. Some said grief had hollowed her into nothing. Others said disease was gnawing at her lungs. Still others, bolder, claimed the king himself wished her gone. Richard needed an heir. Edward was dead. And Anne, wasting away, could not give him another child. That fact was poison enough. At court, usefulness was survival. Once a woman lost her ability to bear children, her worth slipped from her like water through open fingers. Anne felt it. She felt the eyes glance past her, the conversations that stopped when she entered, the widening distance even in Richard's gaze. He had once fought to marry her, to seize her inheritance. But now that inheritance was secured and her womb was empty, it is said that Richard considered putting her aside, that he even contemplated marrying Elizabeth of York, his own niece, to secure his claim to the throne. Chroniclers whisper that Anne heard these rumors, that she watched as her husband's ambition reached toward another woman while she, the queen, still breathed. The humiliation was quiet but devastating. Imagine her walking through the great hall, torches burning against cold stone. She steps carefully, her gown brushing the floor. But no one bows deeply. They murmur instead. They wonder how much longer she will live. They wonder who will replace her. In those moments, Anne was alive but erased. She was a queen in name, but not in presence. She was consort in title, but not in power. She sat at feasts and was barely acknowledged. She stood in processions, but left no impression. She was the shadow of a crown. The crown itself was slipping too. Richard's reign was faltering. Rebellion simmered. The threat of Henry Tudor grew louder each day. The dynasty cracked at its core, and Anne, with her body failing and her spirit broken, was no source of strength. Some said she grew jealous of Elizabeth of York. Others said she was too weak to care. The truth is lost, but what endures is the image. A sickly queen, her hands trembling as she clutched at her robes, while rumors of her replacement grew louder than the prayers at her bedside. Disease carved her away piece by piece. Perhaps it was tuberculosis. Perhaps it was pneumonic plague. Whatever the name, it was relentless. Her cough echoed in the corridors. Her skin turned pale and damp. Each breath grew harder, as though the air itself conspired to abandon her. And still she endured the humiliation of being forgotten while alive. The irony was sharp. As a girl, she had been valuable because of her father. As a bride, she had been valuable because of her inheritance. As a mother, She had been valuable because of her son, but as herself, Anne Neville was never valued at all. Now, stripped of father, husband, and child, she was simply Anne, and Anne was invisible. There is something crueler than death. To walk the halls of a palace and know that you are already a ghost. In her final months, she carried that knowledge. Each day she lived was another day of erasure. She was a queen no one wanted to remember. Sometimes, history records silence more loudly than words. Anne Neville's silence fills the pages of the chronicles of 1484 and 1485. She is barely mentioned, except in whispers of sickness and rumors of Richard's desire to remarry. Yet that silence says everything. It tells us of a woman who had become weightless in her own life, erased by the machinery of ambition, fading like smoke long before her body was laid to rest. And so she lived, the shadow in the palace. She wore the crown, but the crown had never belonged to her. She sat on the throne, but the throne had never carried her name. She lived in the court, but the court had already turned its face away. Anne Neville had been reduced to the faintest trace. A cough in the dark, a rumor in the hall, a shadow sliding along cold stone walls. A queen who no longer mattered. The end came on March 16th, 1485. Anne Neville was only 28, but her body was that of someone twice her age, ravaged by sickness and sorrow. She lay in Westminster, lungs burning, breath shallow, skin pale as linen. Outside her chamber, whispers traveled faster than prayers. She was dying. Everyone knew it. Yet the question was not how, but why. The chronicles speak of disease. Some wrote of tuberculosis, the slow rot of the lungs. Others believed it was pneumonic plague, the swift and brutal kind, devouring life in days. But rumor, always louder than truth, spoke of poison. Poison in her food, poison in her cup, poison slipped into her body by the very man who had once fought to marry her, Richard III. Why? Because her son was dead, because she was sick, because she was no longer useful, because Richard, desperate to secure his throne, sought to marry again. And not just anyone, Elizabeth of York, his own niece. The scandal was fire. The image of a king casting off his queen, replacing her with a girl half her age, set London buzzing. To the people, Anne was not simply dying. She was being erased. Richard was forced to deny it publicly. On the very day of her death, he stood before courtiers and declared that he had no plans to marry Elizabeth, that his wife was honored, that he had not poisoned her. But denials, once spoken, are proof that whispers have power. And Anne? She had no voice left. Imagine her in those final hours. A queen in name, gasping for air in a chamber where even her servants hesitated to linger. Did she hear the rumors? Did she know that her death was already being claimed as scandal? Did she realize that her husband's protest would matter more to history than her own fading breath? The tragedy is sharp. Anne's body failed her, but her memory was poisoned too. She could not die in peace. She died surrounded by suspicion. Even her last moment was stolen, consumed by politics, turned into gossip. 28 years, that was all. 28 years from Warwick Castle to Westminster. From daughter of the Kingmaker to widow of Lancaster. From pawn of politics to Queen of England. And at the end, nothing. No power, no love, no child. Only whispers that her death was convenient. The image is stark. A young queen coughing blood onto her sheets while courtiers murmur about her husband's next bride. the crown on her head meaningless, heavy, mocking, the walls of the palace cold, the silence louder than any prayer. Her death marked more than the end of a woman. It marked the unraveling of Richard's reign. With no heir, no queen, and no trust from his people, the foundations of his throne shook. 5 months later, he would fall at Bosworth, his body left naked and dishonored in the mud. But Anne did not live to see it. She was buried that same March in Westminster Abbey, buried without grandeur, without a monument, without even a name carved into stone. A Queen of England consigned to anonymity. Her death is a lesson in how easily women were erased. Kings who ruled for months had their effigies. Knights who died in skirmishes had their epitaphs. But Anne Neville, crowned queen, had nothing. Only soil, only silence. And the rumors did not die with her. For centuries, historians and storytellers returned to that chamber in Westminster, asking the same question. Was she poisoned? Or was it disease? Was Richard ruthless enough to kill his own wife? Or was Anne simply one more victim of the age's cruelty? The truth is unknowable. But the cruelty lies in the fact that the truth no longer mattered. What endured was the suspicion. Her death became part of Richard's legend, another shadow in his already dark reputation. Anne herself, her pain, her humanity, her broken heart, was lost beneath it. This is the fate of queens who do not rule. They die, and their deaths are rewritten to fit the needs of others. Anne Neville died at 28, but she also died in the whispers, in the doubts, in the scandal that devoured her name. And perhaps the cruelest detail, Richard's denial, his desperate attempt to clear himself, was the last act to which her life was tied. Not her coronation, not her motherhood, not her grief, but her husband's public insistence that he had not poisoned her. She deserved better. But history gave her only suspicion. The crown on her head was hollow. And in the end, even her death was hollow too. Queens are meant to be remembered. Their crowns should glitter in chronicles. Their tombs should rise in stone and marble. Their names should echo in prayers. But Anne Neville, Queen of England, was buried as if she had never existed. March 1485. Her body, frail and wasted, was lowered into the ground at Westminster Abbey. No grand procession, no effigy carved to guard her, no monument to tell the world she had been queen. She was laid in earth without inscription, without honor, without a voice. Her grave was anonymous, a hollow and sacred ground swallowed by silence. Think of the irony. This was Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens were immortalized in marble and alabaster, where Edward the Confessor's shrine glowed in candlelight, where Edward III, Henry V, and later monarchs would rest beneath carved stone canopies. Yet Anne was left in nothingness. No words, no marker. She was queen, and yet she was forgotten in the very place that preserved memory. For centuries, no one knew precisely where she lay. Visitors walked across the floor above her without pause. Pilgrims prayed for saints, but not for her. Even her name slipped from lips. She was dust beneath stone, nothing more. Why? Perhaps because Richard's reign was short, violent, and cursed. Perhaps because her death was overshadowed by rumor and scandal. Perhaps because in the months after she died, her husband lost his throne, his life, and his dynasty. With him, her memory collapsed too. History is cruel to those caught on the losing side. And Anne had always been on the losing side. Her father, the Kingmaker, died in defeat. Her first husband, Edward of Westminster, died in defeat. Her second husband, Richard III, died in defeat. And Anne herself? She died in silence, erased by the very crown she wore. Centuries passed, stones shifted, records blurred. No monument rose for her, no chapel bore her name. Only later, in the 20th century, was a modest plaque finally placed in Westminster to acknowledge her presence. A whisper of remembrance, centuries too late. But what does a plaque mean against centuries of silence? The absence of her tomb speaks louder than any epitaph. It tells us how little her life mattered to those who came after. It tells us that queens without heirs, queens without power, queens who vanish into the machinery of ambition, are denied even the dignity of memory. Walk today through Westminster Abbey. The air is heavy with history. You see tombs of kings and conquerors, saints and poets. You see gilded inscriptions, statues, coats of arms. But beneath your feet lies Anne Neville, unmarked, uncelebrated, a queen reduced to dust without name. And this anonymity reflects her life. She was never allowed to exist as herself. Always a daughter, always a wife, always a pawn. Never Anne. Never simply Anne. Her nameless grave is her truest monument. A void, a silence, an emptiness that mirrors the hollow crown she wore. Some might argue that she was forgotten because she left no legacy. No children to carry her name, no political achievements to shape history. But perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps her very absence is her legacy. She is the embodiment of what happens to women erased by power, consumed by dynasties, discarded when their usefulness ends. Anne's grave is not just her own. It is the grave of countless women whose lives were bartered away, whose names dissolved, whose voices never entered the chronicles. She lies for them too. She lies for every woman silenced, buried without inscription, remembered only in rumor and shadow. The abbey itself seems to conspire in this forgetting. The stones conceal her. The prayers pass over her. Time erases her footprints. She is there, and yet not there. Present and absent. Visible and invisible. And maybe this is the final cruelty. That Anne Neville's life and death are perfectly symmetrical. Born into power she could not use. Married into crowns she could not keep. Buried in a place that should have remembered her, but did not. Her story is a void, her tomb a silence. But silence too can speak. Stand long enough in Westminster Abbey, and you can almost hear it. Not the voices of kings, not the triumph of warriors, but the whisper of a queen whose grave was never marked. A whisper asking, what is the value of a crown if it ends in nothing? Anne Neville's tomb is invisible, but her silence is eternal. Anne Neville's story was not unique. That is perhaps the most tragic part of all. She was one of many. A daughter given away like coin, a bride exchanged for alliances, a mother judged only by the survival of her child. And when that child died, she became invisible. Her life was not an exception. It was the rule. The Wars of the Roses were wars of men. Chroniclers wrote of kings and dukes, of banners and battles, of crowns seized and crowns lost. But beneath that thunder was another story, quieter but no less brutal. The story of women who bore the cost. They were queens without power, daughters without choice, mothers without protection. Look closely, and you will see them everywhere. Margaret of Anjou, fierce and relentless, leading armies to protect her son, only to see him butchered at Tewkesbury. Elizabeth Woodville, queen to Edward IV, forced into sanctuary with her children, hiding from enemies who would kill them. Cecily Neville, matriarch of York, watching her sons slaughtered, her grandsons vanishing in the Tower. And Anne Neville, child pawn, bride widow, queen forgotten. Their lives were not their own. They were shaped, broken, and consumed by the war. Their marriages were treaties. Their wombs were battlefields. Their children were weapons. And when they failed to deliver, when they could not produce heirs, or when fate snatched those heirs away, they were discarded like shattered swords. Anne's fate illustrates the machinery perfectly. As a girl, she was valuable because of her father. As a wife, she was valuable because of her husband. As a mother, she was valuable because of her son. When all three were gone, her value disappeared. This is the pattern of history, not just in England. Across Europe, across dynasties, across centuries, women of noble birth were raised not as individuals, but as vessels. They carried alliances in their hands, inheritances in their blood, heirs in their bodies. And when those vessels cracked, they were cast aside. The cruelty lies in the ordinariness. Anne's death at 28 was not extraordinary. Women died young, from childbirth, from plague, from grief. Entire generations of queens, duchesses, and princesses ended the same way. Consumed by duty, erased by history. What makes Anne's story linger is not that she was different, but that she was the same. She embodies the silence of thousands. She is a symbol of a system that devoured women and remembered only men. And yet, there is a bitter irony. Even in death, women like Anne were used. Her passing became fuel for rumors about Richard III, ammunition in the political wars of the day. Her body, her silence, her grave, all were turned into tools for someone else's story, never her own. Think of the nameless queens who shared her fate. Women who endured marriages arranged by men they barely knew. Women who bore child after child until their bodies failed. Women who buried sons and daughters and still were expected to smile in processions. Women who vanished into cloisters, into obscurity, into silence. Anne's story forces us to look at them, to see what history prefers to ignore. For centuries, history praised the Kingmaker, the men who fought at Tewkesbury, the king who ruled after Richard fell. But what of Anne? What of the others? The chronicles barely mention them, yet their lives bore the scars of war as deeply as any soldier's body, perhaps deeper. Soldiers fought once and died. Women like Anne fought every day, with no weapons, no armor, no honor. They fought in silence, in childbirth, in grief, in endurance. Anne Neville is remembered not because she triumphed, but because she did not. Her story is not one of victory, but of loss. Loss so complete that it mirrors the hollow crown she wore. And so, her life becomes a mirror of her age. An age where women's bodies were pawns, where their choices were erased, where their graves were forgotten. The Wars of the Roses ended long ago. But Anne's silence remains. It presses against us even now, reminding us that history is written by those who survive. But survival is not always life. Her story asks a question. What is the worth of power if it consumes the powerless? What is the worth of crowns if they erase the queens who wear them? Anne Neville did not live long enough to answer. But her silence is an answer of its own. It tells us that her life was not an anomaly, but a pattern. That her fate was not exceptional, but inevitable. That behind every king crowned in the Wars of the Roses, there stood a woman like Anne, erased, forgotten, buried without name. And that is the deepest tragedy of all. The story circles back to where it began, the hollow crown. Anne Neville wore it, but it was never hers. It glittered in the torchlight of Westminster. It shone in the ceremonies where her husband stood triumphant. Yet inside, it was empty. Empty of power. Empty of choice. Empty of life. And that emptiness is the true legacy of Anne's reign. She was a queen who left no words behind. No letters survive in her voice. No chronicles carry her opinions. No portraits capture her gaze. She has no tomb that bears her name. She is almost invisible. And yet, invisibility itself tells us more than marble ever could. Because Anne Neville was not one. She was many. She was the embodiment of women whose lives were consumed by war, politics, and dynasties. She was the face of 1,000 silent queens and consorts who lived and died without memory. Her crown was hollow because it was built on a world that valued her only as long as she could serve. When her father needed her, she was a pawn. When her husband needed her, she was a vessel. When her child lived, she was a mother. When all three were gone, she was nothing. This is the machinery of history. A machinery that rewards ambition but punishes fragility. That glorifies victory but discards grief. That records the names of kings but erases the women who bore their heirs. Anne's silence is not an accident. It is a design. And that design raises questions that still matter today. How many lives have been erased because they did not fit the narrative of power? How many women, across centuries, were buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost to dust? How many crowns were hollow, and how many queens were shadows beneath them? We walk through Westminster Abbey and see monuments to conquerors. But beneath the same stones lies a queen without a name. We read of Richard III, his crooked spine, his violent end. But his wife, Anne, his queen, was almost forgotten. Almost. Because telling her story is an act of defiance. It is choosing to remember what history tried to erase. It is shining a light into the silence and saying, she was here, and that matters. For in Anne's story, we do not only see the past, we see ourselves. We see the cost of ambition, the cruelty of indifference, the danger of silence. We see the fragility of every crown, every throne, every name carved in stone. History is not just about kings. It is about the forgotten, about the hollow places, about the voices that never reached the page. Anne Neville's crown was empty, but her silence speaks louder than gold. And now you have heard it. If you have walked with her through this journey, through her childhood in Warwick Castle, through her widowhood at Tewkesbury, through her quiet suffering in Westminster, then you have carried her memory a little further into the future. That is how the forgotten live again. Not through monuments, not through crowns, but through stories. And that is why we tell them. Because the past is not only made of battles and kings. It is made of the hollow crowns, the invisible queens, the whispers that history almost lost. So remember Anne Neville, not as a queen who ruled, but as a woman erased. Not as a crown glittering in triumph, but as a crown hollow in silence. And if her story has spoken to you, if you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then I invite you to stay with us. This is Dark Ages Unveiled, a place where history's shadows come alive, a place where the silences speak. Subscribe so that together we can uncover the untold, the hidden, the erased.